The Crying Mouth. That night at midnight, the entire neighborhood of Khaduk heard the voice of a blind old woman, who had been dead for 3 days, crying inside the throat of her own daughter. The crying did not start loud. It began as a dry, choking sob, like someone whose mouth had been stuffed and was trying to swallow it down. Then it seeped out little by little, low and guttural, broken, stretching on and on inside the old corrugated tin house that sat right at the edge of the canal. By day, you could still hear boat engines passing, ducks quacking below the dock, children calling to one another on their way to school. But at that moment it was exactly 12 midnight, and the wind blowing up from the river was piercing cold. Empty barges bumped against each other out on the water with a hollow clank. And inside the pitch-black room, Mrs. Namhung sat bolt upright, both hands clutching her own throat, eyes rolled white with terror. She wanted to scream, wanted to call the neighbors, wanted to cry for help, but her mouth only opened without producing a sound. Her throat convulsed in spasms, blue veins bulging along both sides of her neck as though an invisible hand were squeezing from the inside. Then a voice, hoarse, thick, wet and cold, suddenly burst from her mouth. Not the voice of Namhung, but the voice of Mrs. Tulua, the blind mother who had just been buried in the red earth behind the temple. The voice sobbed in broken gasps. "Hung, dear, your mother is hungry. Why did you leave me in the cold like this, child?" When Namhung heard those words coming from her own mouth, her entire body went rigid. Her teeth chattered against each other, cold sweat beaded across her forehead, ran down her temples, soaked into the collar of her old silk blouse. She pressed her hands over her mouth, but the crying still escaped through her fingers, a thin reedy sound like wine through a crack in rotten wood. Out in the yard, the black dog belonging to Mrs. Hai Shuyan suddenly tucked its tail, and howled for a long unbroken moment before slithering all the way under the raised platform. The neighboring houses clicked their lights on. Everyone could hear clearly that inside Namhung's house there was the voice of an old woman crying and calling for her child, even though everyone knew that old woman had been lying in the cold earth for 3 days now. Welcome, dear listeners, to the YouTube channel Kim Ghost Stories of Cause and Effect. Tonight, please join us for a story set in the countryside of Vietnam's Mekong Delta, a place where funerals sometimes feature not only the tears of grieving relatives, but also hired mourners who weep and wail and call out the names of the departed with such heartbreaking sincerity that even strangers find themselves shedding tears. But in this life, there are tears that cost more money and yet become cheaper for it. And there are people who, by the time they finally want to cry with true feeling, discover that their throat no longer belongs to them. In the neighborhood of Khaduk, tucked among a maze of small winding canals, everyone knew Mrs. Namhung. She was past 50, short, square-shouldered, skin darkened by sun and wind, hair always pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Her face was not beautiful, but she had a pair of very unusual eyes. Normally they were sharp and cold, sizing up everyone as though calculating their worth. But the moment she stepped into a funeral, draped a white mourning cloth over her head, and sat down beside the coffin, those eyes would instantly redden and glisten as though they held an entire lifetime of suffering ready to overflow. People in the area called her Namhung, the hired crier. That name had followed her for more than 20 years, so long that many people had forgotten her real given name was Nguyen Thi Hung. Mrs. Namhung had a special talent that not every professional mourner possessed. She knew how to read the family circumstances of the deceased and tailor her crying accordingly. If the dead person was a father, she would weep about the sacrifice of raising children, about the stooped back in the rice fields, about the calloused hands that had fed a family for a lifetime. If it was a mother, she would cry about the kitchen hearth, about bowls of rice, about a patched blouse, about the palm leaf fan waving back and forth on sweltering afternoons. If the deceased was young, she cried even more terribly, as though her very guts were being torn out piece by piece, crying so hard that even the guests in the funeral tent who had been chatting would fall completely silent. She did not cry carelessly. She knew when to hiccup, when to wail, when to choke silent so that the listeners could fill in the rest with their own imagination. Her crying voice was deep and resonant, sometimes dropping low like water draining from a canal, then suddenly soaring high like a funeral horn tearing across the afternoon sky. Wealthy families were especially fond of her. At funerals where the children were too busy with business, or where family ties had grown cold and they feared public scorn, people would send someone to fetch Mrs. Nam Hung. She would come and sit beside the coffin and cry in place of the children. Once, a rice merchant from across the river hired her to cry for his biological mother. The funeral was enormous, the tent covered the entire yard. Western horns blew from morning till night. Roast pig, trays of fruit, and wreaths filled the walkways. The children and grandchildren were dressed in fine clothes, but their eyes were dry and shifting. And so there sat only Mrs. Nam Hung beside the coffin, gently tapping the lid as she wept. Mother, you spent your whole life bent over to raise us, and now that you lie down, why is it so cold? Mother, I call your name once and you won't even open your eyes to look at me. With that, the entire funeral tent erupted in commotion. People wiped their tears. Someone said that listening to Mrs. Nam Hung cry, you would think the dead woman was your own mother. From then on, the money flowing into Mrs. Nam Hung's hands grew with each passing month. She was not rich by any means, but in that poor canal-side neighborhood, she was considered well off. Her house had a brick front wall, a tiled floor, a glass cabinet for teacups, a large altar table made of solid rosewood that gleamed with furniture polish at all times. She wore gold earrings, a jade bracelet on her wrist, and to every funeral she wore a newly pressed silk blouse with crisp pleats. People praised her, saying she was blessed because her mouth knew how to grieve for the dead. She would hear that and only smile thinly, draping her scarf over her shoulder, telling the women at the market, if you don't know how to make money while you're alive, no one will cry for you when you're dead. But few people knew that behind that clean brick house, right at the edge of the wild banana grove, there was another structure, low, with rotting leaf walls and a corrugated tin roof riddled with holes, so that every time it rained, water dripped tic-tac through the night. Inside that shack lived Mrs. Tu Lua, Nam Hung's biological mother. Mrs. Tu had been blind for nearly 10 years. Both eyes had turned the cloudy white of stale rice water. No matter where she looked, she saw only a thick, murky darkness. For her entire life she had carried trays of steamed rice cakes and gelatinous desserts to sell at the river landings, raising her only daughter alone. Her husband had died early. She remained a widow, scrimping every penny, skipping meals, going without new clothes so that Hung could learn to read, could wear proper clothes to school. When Hung was young and often fell ill, it was Mrs. Tu who had carried her on her back across slippery monkey bridges in the dead of night, stumbling to the herbalist's house, her lips never stopping their prayers. Yet when Hung grew up, learned to earn money, learned to command the respect of strangers at funerals, that blind old mother became a shadow to be discarded. At first Mrs. Tu was still allowed to stay in the back room of the main house. But once she began knocking things over, dropping bowls and chopsticks because of her failing eyesight, bumping into furniture, Nam Hung grew irritated. She was afraid that visitors would see the ragged old woman and think less of her. So she moved her mother out to the shack behind the garden. She told outsiders that her mother preferred it there, quiet, with a breeze, better for resting. But those who lived close knew the truth. In the dry season that shack was sweltering like an oven. In the rainy season it was freezing, wind whistling through the leaf walls, the smell of canal mud seeping in with a damp mustiness. One cold evening, Mrs. Tu groped her way to the main house to ask for a blanket. Nam Hung was counting her funeral earnings, and did not look up. She just snapped, "You'd be cold lying anywhere, old woman. I've been crying all day, and I'm dead tired. Stop making trouble." Mrs. Tu said nothing. The silence of a guilty old woman was not the absence of pain, but pain so deep it had drained her of even the strength to complain. She turned and felt her way back along the wall, her bony hand groping in the darkness, her fingernails scraping lightly against the plaster with a faint scratching sound. Mrs. Hai Shuyan, who lived next door, saw this many times and her heart ached. She would bring over a bowl of porridge, some boiled sweet potatoes, an old shirt. Mrs. Tu received each offering with both hands, lips trembling with gratitude, but every time she whispered the same thing, "Don't tell Hung, sister. She works so hard, crying all day. I'm old, I can eat very little." As time went on, Nam Hung became more and more famous. The dead she mourned for grew wealthier, and her fees climbed higher. There were funerals in neighboring districts that hired a boat just to ferry her over to cry. Sometimes she was away for 2 or 3 days at a stretch. Meanwhile, at home, Mrs. Tulua survived on leftover rice left in the bamboo steamer, a water bottle placed by the bed, and the increasingly rare sound of her daughter's footsteps. Every evening, when the sun dropped red and heavy behind the water hyacinths, Mrs. Tu would sit on the old platform in front of her shack, her face turned toward the brick house. She could not see anything, but she sat there as though hearing her daughter cough once, hearing her daughter's slippers cross the yard, was enough to warm her heart just a little. One afternoon in the 7th lunar month, the Mekong Delta sky opened up and rain fell in sheets from morning on. The water in the canal rose muddy and turbulent, carrying water hyacinths, rotting branches, and the sharp fresh smell of exposed riverbed mud. Nam Hung was preparing to go cry at a large funeral across the river. The family was wealthy, an old woman had died, the children were prosperous, and word was they were paying her triple the usual rate, provided she cried convincingly enough that the whole village would believe the family was filial. She put on a new black silk blouse, dabbed on a little perfume, folded a white mourning cloth neatly, and placed it in her bag. Before leaving, she stopped by her mother's shack, not out of concern, but because she could hear the old woman coughing in violent spasms. Inside the shack, Mrs. Tu lay curled on the platform, a thin shirt clinging to her back, silver hair matted with sweat. The bowl of leftover rice beside her had dried hard, and a line of ants marched in formation around its rim. Hearing her daughter's footsteps, she propped herself up on trembling arms, her clouded eyes turning toward the doorway, her voice so weak it nearly dissolved into the rain. "Hung. Is that you? Could you give me a bowl of hot rice? I'm so cold inside." Nam Hung froze for a moment, but from the yard came the sound of someone calling from the boat, urging her to hurry. She looked at her mother, then at the rain, her face flickering with irritation. She walked to the bamboo steamer, took out the leftover rice from noon, splashed in some fish sauce at random, and set it down beside her mother's hand. Her voice was curt. "Eat this for now. I have a big job, I can't be late. When I finish crying for them, I'll figure things out tomorrow." Mrs. Tu reached out with groping fingers, her dry fingertips touching the cold side of the bowl. She said nothing more, only nodded very slightly, as though afraid of being a further burden. Nam Hung turned away, pulled the mourning scarf over her head, and strode quickly out into the rain. Behind her, Mrs. Tu sat in the gray dimness of the shack, both hands clutching the bowl of cold rice, her lips moving as though wanting to call her daughter back. But in the end, only the thinnest sigh escaped. That night, at the funeral across the river, Nam Hung cried so beautifully that the entire host family praised her. She knelt beside the coffin, slapped her palm against the tiled floor, her voice cracking with genuine-sounding anguish. "Mother, now that you're gone, who will chew betel with me? Who will wait for me at every evening meal? Who will love me the way you did, Mother?" The mourners in the tent began to cry along, one by one. The dead woman's children, who had been standing outside checking their phones, hurried back in and pretended to wipe their eyes. The hostess secretly slipped Hung an extra thick envelope. Nam Hung took the money, and the corner of her mouth twitched upward beneath the edge of her mourning cloth. But at that exact moment, back in the shack behind her house, Mrs. Tulua dropped her bowl of rice onto the dirt floor. The ceramic bowl split in two. The cold rice scattered, dust and rainwater soaking into it. She fumbled and crouched, her trembling hands sweeping across the sharp shards. A thin line of blood welled up from a fingertip, but she could not see it. Rain hammered on the punctured tin roof. A gust of wind blew out the small oil lamp on the platform. In the thick darkness, Mrs. Tu called out very softly, "Hung." No one answered. Near dawn, when Nam Hung finally returned home, her funeral fees still tucked inside her blouse, her throat raw from crying, she noticed 3 incense sticks burning by the door of her mother's shack. No one knew who had lit them. The sticks were planted in an old milk can, their red tips flickering feebly in the drizzle. What was strange was that all 3 sticks were not burning straight, they had bent, curving in the same direction, like 3 wet, shriveled fingers pointing at the shack door. Nam Hung stood still for a few seconds. On the wet ground below, a long smear stretched from the platform to the doorway, the mark of a blind woman who had tried to drag herself through the night. She stepped inside. The smell of dampness, old medicinal oil, and scorched rice hit her like a wall, and she wrinkled her nose. On the wooden platform, Mrs. Tulua lay on her side. One arm hung limp over the edge, the fingers still curled as though reaching for a bowl. Her clouded eyes were half open, facing the doorway, as though even in her final moment, she had been waiting for the sound of her daughter's footsteps. Namhung stood beside her for a very long time. Her face showed no change in expression. Not a single cry escaped her lips. Only her throat moved in a slow swallow, dry and heavy. Outside, the 3 bent incense sticks suddenly flared red in the early morning wind. The ash fell to the wet ground and melted into a small dark stain. Namhung bent down and pulled an old reed mat over her mother's face, muttering to herself in a voice cold as ice, "When you're old, your day comes eventually. Why make a big fuss and waste money?" The moment she said that, from beneath the old mat, from where Mrs. Tulua's hand hung limp, a single withered finger twitched. It curled inward, scraping against the mat with a sound so faint, masked by the rain on the roof, that it still made Namhung freeze where she stood. She stared at her mother's bony hand beneath the edge of the mat. That finger had moved only once, so lightly that anyone else might have thought they were seeing things. But she had seen it clearly. The yellowed, opaque fingernail of Mrs. Tulua had scratched a thin curved line across the mat, like the mark of a half-burned incense stick. In that instant, Namhung's throat closed. She stepped back, her heel crunching against the broken bowl shards on the floor. The sound of ceramic grinding against ceramic sent a chill down her spine. But this was a woman who had made her living controlling her own tears. She knew when to tremble, when to bow her head, when to sigh so that others would pity her. And because of that, she also knew how to hide her fear very quickly. She crouched down, pulled the mat tighter over the body, and told herself that newly dead bodies sometimes still had reflexive muscle spasms. There was nothing to be afraid of. She had sat beside hundreds of coffins. She had seen corpses whose mouth corners still twitched with anger, whose toes still curled, whose eyelids still flickered from the cold. People were afraid because they were not accustomed to death. But she was too accustomed. So accustomed that sometimes she looked at a dead body the way she looked at a job about to be paid for. As dawn brightened slightly, the rain still falling in a fine drizzle, Namhung stepped out to the yard and called to the neighbor. Mrs. Hai Shuyan, who was lighting her kitchen fire, heard the call and hurried over, throwing a thin raincoat over her shoulders. The moment she reached the shack doorway, she stopped. The smell of the dead, mixed with scorched rice, old medicinal oil, and the mustiness of a long damp tin roof, made her gag. She looked at the platform, at the broken bowl on the floor, and then at Namhung's impassive face. Mrs. Hai's eyes reddened instantly. She stepped forward and gently lifted the mat. She saw Mrs. Tulua lying there, cheeks sunken, lips cracked and split, eye sockets hollowed deep, her hands still curled as though clutching an invisible bowl. Mrs. Hai bent down and smoothed the dead woman's silver hair, her voice shaking. "Poor Sister Tuesday. It rained so hard last night, why didn't you let her come inside the house where it was warm, Hung?" Namhung turned her face away. Her voice was slightly sharp, but controlled enough that an outsider could not pin anything on her. "My mother had been weak for a long time, Sister Hai, you know that. It's not like I neglected her. I came home late from work, I didn't know when she passed. When your time is up, you can die in a brick house just as easily, it's not because of the shack." Mrs. Hai fell silent at that. There are some accusations that, once spoken, only add to the dead person's suffering. She looked down at the ground, at the smear leading from the platform to the door, at the grains of cold rice stuck to the dirt, at the small smear of dried blood on Mrs. Tu's fingertip. She understood that the blind old woman had not passed peacefully in the night. She had tried to crawl, tried to find the door, tried to call her daughter in the pitch-black shack while the rain hammered down. But Mrs. Hai was only a neighbor. In times like these, no matter how deeply you felt for someone else's family, you could only swallow your grief and say nothing. The funeral of Mrs. Tu Lua was arranged in great haste. Nam Hung said her mother had died old, there was no need for ceremony. She did not hire musicians, did not erect a funeral tent, did not invite a chanting troupe for the overnight vigil. There was only a cheap wooden coffin hastily stained dark brown, a few funeral cloths, a simple vegetarian meal, and a plain white mourning band tied loosely around her forehead, a perfunctory gesture. The neighbors heard the news and trickled over. They all knew that Nam Hung was famous for her hard crying, so they waited to see how she would cry for her own mother. Some even whispered in the yard that this funeral would surely feature the most gut-wrenching wailing of her life. After all, how could mourning a biological mother be anything like mourning a stranger? But throughout that entire morning, Nam Hung did not cry. She walked in and out, holding a small notebook to record condolence money, instructing the pallbearers to watch the walls, telling the relatives to eat a piece of cake, drink a cup of tea. Someone sitting by the coffin hinted gently, "Hung, come sit with your mother for a while. She suffered her whole life for you. Now she's lying there, say a few words to bring her peace." Nam Hung stepped over, stood at the head of the coffin for a moment, and looked at her mother's face through the glass panel. That face had shrunk, gentle, forbearing, as though she had spent her entire life yielding, right up to her final breath. Nam Hung's lips pressed together. Her eyes were dry and hard. In the end, she only took an incense stick, planted it in the burner before the coffin, and turned to the person beside her. "Uncles, please arrange the burial as soon as possible so I can catch the tide." That sentence made the entire room go silent. Mrs. Hai Shuyan sat in the corner, both hands on her knees, tears falling silently. She was crying in place of a mother who had no one to cry for her with a true heart. Outside, the rain had stopped but the sky remained gray. The banana leaves behind the house dripped heavily with water. On the altar table, 3 freshly lit incense sticks began to bend. Not from wind, there was no wind inside the house. They bent slowly, their red tips drooping toward Nam Hung. The ash fell in segments onto the table surface, leaving dark spots like burn marks on skin. When it was time to carry the coffin, 4 men from the neighborhood lifted it out of the house. There was no wailing, no drumming, no sound of children grieving. Only the soft slap of slippers on the wet dirt path, the distant call of a cuckoo bird in the canal thicket, the rasping of tree frogs on the water hyacinths. Nam Hung walked behind the coffin, a mourning band on her head, an incense bundle in her hand. People watched her, waiting for a single sob. But her face was as blank as the murky water at the foot of the bridge. At one point she raised her hand to her throat and cleared her voice, whether from cold or from something lodged in her windpipe, no one could tell. Then she walked on, eyes staring straight ahead, as though she were escorting a distant stranger. Mrs. Tu's grave was dug in a low-lying plot behind the old temple, next to a crumbling columbarium. Few people passed through here. Unclaimed bone urns sat on brick shelves inside a small room with rotting wooden doors and mossy tiles. Some urns still had red paper with names faded almost to nothing. Others had only a scrap of white cloth tied around the neck, dust caked so thick you could no longer tell the original color of the glaze. Locals said these were the remains of people who died without children, or whose children had moved far away and forgotten them. Each rainy season, a damp chill rose from the earthen floor, so that the columbarium was always cold and smelled of old incense, of cold ashes, of people who had been forgotten. As Mrs. Tu's coffin was set down beside the grave, Nam Hung stood near the columbarium door and happened to glance inside. In the dim light, the rows of urns sat in silent rows like faceless heads staring outward. An old incense stick planted before the shelf had long since gone out, yet its tip was still bent crookedly, blackened, like a burned finger. Nam Hung shuddered and immediately looked away. She did not like places where there was no money to be made. The dead in those nameless urns, no one hired her to cry for them, so to her they were merely silent, useless things gathering dust in a temple. When the men lowered Mrs. Tu's coffin into the grave, the rope squeaked against the wooden edges. The soil at the bottom was soggy from rain, and the bearers had to grip hard to keep the coffin from tilting. Mrs. Hai Shuyan broke down in loud sobbing, calling out, "Sister too," in a voice that tore at the guts. Nam-hung stood motionless. An old man in the neighborhood looked at her, and shook his head very slightly. Perhaps he did not blame her for not wailing, everyone grieves in their own way. But Nam-hung's silence was not restrained grief. It was dry and flat, like a pond sealed over with scum after a long drought. The first handful of earth hit the coffin lid. Then the second. The third. The wet soil thudded against the wood, heavy and muffled. Nam-hung raised the incense bundle to face level and mumbled a few perfunctory words. But at that exact moment, from deep inside the grave, a small hollow sound rang out. The men shoveling earth froze. Mrs. Hai Shuyan's face went white. The sound came again, so faint, like a fingernail scratching from the inside of the coffin lid. No one spoke. A fine drizzle began to fall again, covering the mouth of the grave with a thin white veil. A young man swallowed hard and forced a nervous smile. "It's just dirt falling on the wood, don't be scared." But even as he said it, his own hands were trembling. Nam-hung stared down into the grave. In that very brief moment, she saw near the edge of the coffin a smear of mud stretching outward, shaped like a withered hand gripping the side of the wood. But when she blinked and looked again, there was only wet, glistening earth. The burial was finished quickly after that. Soil poured down in greater quantities, covering the coffin lid, burying the strange sound beneath. Nam-hung did not wait for the incense to burn down. She planted the bundle on top of the grave, nudged a few clods of dirt flat with her foot, and turned to the gravediggers. "Finish up quickly for me, I have things to do." Mrs. Hai Shuyan choked at those words. She looked at the fresh mound of earth, then watched Nam-hung's figure disappear behind the beetle palms behind the temple. For the first time in her life, Mrs. Hai saw a professional mourner walk away from her own mother's grave as lightly as if she were discarding an old shirt. That afternoon, the moment she got home, Nam-hung pulled out the envelope from the previous day's funeral and counted the money again. The paper bills still carried the warm smell of living hands. She smoothed each bill flat and tucked it into the bottom drawer of her cabinet. On the altar table in the central room, Mrs. Tu Lua's portrait was placed temporarily in an old wooden frame. The photograph had been taken years earlier, when Mrs. Tu's eyes had clouded over but were not yet fully blind. In the picture, the old woman sat upright, her mouth slightly smiling, a smile so gentle it was pitiful. Nam-hung lit 3 incense sticks, planted them in a new burner she had bought at the market, and turned to go wash up. But after only a few steps, she heard a very small crackling sound behind her. She turned around. The 3 incense sticks on her mother's altar were not burning straight. They were bending, slowly, their red tips drooping toward the offering bowl of rice. That bowl of rice she had hastily scooped that morning, the rice was dry, no soup, no chopsticks. She frowned, stepped forward to straighten the sticks, but the moment her fingers touched them, a dot of red ash fell squarely onto the back of her hand. She jerked her hand back with a hiss of pain. On the back of her hand, a small red mark appeared, curved, like the mark of a fingernail. Nam-hung blew hard on the incense to scatter the ash, muttering, "You're a nuisance when you're alive, and you still won't rest when you're dead." The moment those words left her mouth, the offering bowl of rice on the altar trembled, just slightly. It did not tip over, did not shift much, only shuddered as though a trembling hand had just touched it. Nam-hung stood frozen. The house was empty. Outside, the wind had stopped. From the direction of the shack behind the garden, where Mrs. Tu had lain, came the sound of old corrugated tin creaking, click-clack, in a slow rhythm, as though someone were feeling their way along the wall, searching for a path home. Nam-hung did not go out to look. She closed the back door and latched it tight. Night fell. The brick house was lit in front, the shack behind the garden sank into damp, empty darkness. On the altar, the 3 incense sticks burned nearly to the base. The ash bent and curled but did not fall, clinging stubbornly like 3 tiny crooked necks. The bowl of rice had caved in on one side. The depression was not shaped like a spoon's mark, it looked like the imprint of several bony fingertips that had just scooped up a pinch of rice. The next morning, as Nam Hung was sitting and drinking tea, a man in a white shirt arrived on a new motorcycle. He was a representative of the family of Councilman Trake from Thanh Thủy Island, one of the wealthiest households in the region. The youngest daughter-in-law of the family, a woman named Tam, had just died after falling into the river at night. The funeral was being held on a grand scale, with many guests, but rumors were circulating that cast the family in an ugly light. They wanted to hire Nam Hung to cry convincingly, to make the world believe that the deceased had been loved and sent off with honor. When she heard the fee, Nam Hung's eyes lit up. She forgot about the red mark on the back of her hand, forgot about the caved-in rice bowl. She pulled a white mourning cloth from the cabinet, shook off the dust, and tested her voice with a few short hiccups. Her throat was slightly hoarse but still resonant. She glanced up at her mother's portrait on the altar, those clouded eyes seemed to be looking at her, and quickly turned away, saying to the man, "All right. A big funeral means I have to cry properly, I'll go." The moment she picked up her bag and headed for the door, an incense stick on her mother's altar, one that had burned out the night before, suddenly snapped in half and fell onto the offering bowl of rice. The black ash planted itself squarely in the depression, like a cold period placed at the end of a warning. Out on the canal, the water was rising, muddy and turbulent. Water hyacinths drifted in thick mats. And in the distance, across toward Thanh Thủy Island, the sound of a funeral horn began to carry over the river, long and mournful, as though calling exactly the woman who was walking toward a funeral she did not know would be her last. Nam Hung stepped off the motorboat at the Thanh Thủy landing as dusk was falling. The river that evening was opaque and muddy, the water high enough to lap at the wild taro growing along the bank. Water hyacinths drifted in thick clusters, their pale purple flowers looking like spots of sadness floating on the current. The man in the white shirt walked ahead, holding a black umbrella, occasionally turning to warn her about the slippery ground. Nam Hung did not answer. She only pulled her mourning scarf tighter around her neck, her eyes flicking toward the large house at the end of the red brick path. From a distance, the funeral was already blazing with light. A white tent covered the entire broad yard. Wreaths were stacked in rows. A western horn played mournful phrases, mixed with the clattering of a portable generator behind the hedge. Councilman Trake's family was the wealthiest in the area. People said his rice fields stretched from one island to the next. His orchards bore fruit in every season, and there were always large boats loading goods at his dock. The main house had a traditional Enyang tile roof, polished dark wood pillars, a tiled floor, and an ancestral altar that stood nearly as tall as the ceiling beams. But that night, despite the bright lights, despite the crowd, the air around the house felt heavy and cold. Incense smoke hung low under the tent roof, it did not rise but pressed into people's faces, sharp and suffocating. The smell of white lilies, new funeral cloth, and rainwater pooled on the tiled yard merged into something cloying, like the smell of a closed room, where a sick person had lain for days without anyone opening a window. The coffin of young Tam was placed in the central room, covered with a white cloth. Red altar candles burned at either end, their flames flickering weakly. The portrait before the coffin showed a young woman with an oval face, sad eyes, and shoulder-length hair. In the photograph she wore a pale-colored traditional dress, her lips slightly pressed together, staring straight out as though wanting to say something but being silenced from behind. The moment Nam Hung approached, she felt a coldness at the nape of her neck. Not the cold of the river wind, but a cold that radiated from the empty space around the coffin. She had sat beside hundreds of coffins, old people, young people, the sick, the injured, the drowned. She knew that each death had its own scent. The sick smelled of medicine. The old smelled of sandalwood, heavy and resigned. But the coffin of young Tam that night carried the scent of fresh sorrow, wet hair, and river water that had lain long in darkness. The hostess, Tam's mother-in-law, came out to receive Nam Hung. She wore white mourning clothes but still had a gold bracelet on her wrist, her face lightly powdered, her eyes dry. Seeing Hung, she pulled her into a hidden corner near the wall and spoke in a rapid, hard whisper, "Sister Hung, cry as tragically as you can. My daughter-in-law was unlucky, our family is heartbroken, but there are so many guests and people are whispering." Cry so that people hear and feel sorry for her, sorry for our family. Don't let them keep talking. Nam-hung looked at the thick envelope being pressed into her hand. It was heavier than any envelope she had ever received. The firm pressure of paper money against her palm softened her voice immediately. She nodded slightly. Don't worry. Once I start crying, even the hardest heart will melt. The mother-in-law exhaled with relief and went back to attending to guests, her face shifting instantly to an expression of sorrow that was just sufficient. Nam-hung watched her go, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. This was her trade. She sold her tears to people who needed them to blind the world. The people who hired her did not always truly grieve, they needed others to believe that they did. And she, as long as the fee was right, could call the dead by name with a voice as intimate as blood. But around Tam's funeral, the whispers would not stay quiet. Nam-hung had barely sat down on the mat near the coffin when she heard several women at the edge of the tent whispering to each other. They said that Tam had not simply slipped into the river as the family claimed. The night she died, neighbors had heard arguing inside the house. Someone had seen her run out to the back garden, one shoulder of her shirt wet, her face ashen, her hair disheveled. Someone else said she had been pregnant, and the family refused to acknowledge it. Still others said the husband was obsessed with gambling and beat her, but the rich family covered it up well, money sealed many mouths. Those words drifted under the tent like moths, faint but stinging. Nam-hung listened but did not ask. Asking too much would only ruin the job. She set her small bag beside her, pulled the white mourning cloth over her head. The moment the cloth touched her hair, her face transformed. Her sharp eyes reddened, her shoulders sagged, her back curved, and her hands resting on the coffin lid began to tremble, as though she were truly a grieving relative. The people sitting nearby fell silent. The funeral horn dropped a full octave. Incense smoke drifted across her face. In that moment, Nam-hung drew a deep breath, pulling from her diaphragm, preparing to push the crying voice up through her throat. But the breath had barely passed her chest when her throat seized. A sharp, dry pain scraped through her windpipe, as though someone had poured a handful of hot ash down inside. She raised her hand to her throat. The pain passed quickly. She told herself it was because she had been crying too much lately, plus her own mother's funeral had exhausted her. She swallowed, adjusted her voice, and began. The crying that emerged was slow at first, low, dense, like a fog rolling over the river at night. She called Tam's name in a voice so agonizing that even the people in the tent, who had been whispering, turned to look. She tapped the coffin lid gently, in measured rhythm, not too hard to seem theatrical, not too soft to lose the pathos. Tam, dear, you were so young, how could you leave us, leave this home, leave this river, and go into the cold like this? The water in the river is so deep, are you cold down there? Why didn't you come back and tell someone who loved you? The entire tent went still. Someone raised a handkerchief to their eyes. The women who had been whispering moments before bowed their heads. Nam-hung's crying wrapped around everyone like a murky current. The more they listened, the more something soft seemed to give way inside them. She knew she was crying well. She shifted her voice to dwell more deeply on the tragedy of a young person's death. She narrated through her tears about a wedding dress not yet old, about an evening meal left half-eaten, about the river that had carelessly swallowed a frail woman's body. She did not need to know whether these images were true or not. They only needed to fit the funeral, to fit the death, to fit the listener's ears. But the more she cried, the more her throat burned. At one point her voice suddenly cracked, dropping into a strange, hoarse register. She quickly covered her mouth with the cloth, pretending to be choked with grief. The audience thought she had become so immersed in her crying that she had lost her voice, and they were moved even more. No one knew that beneath the mourning cloth, Nam-hung's lips were trembling. She had just heard another very small sob slip into the middle of her own crying. That sob was older, weaker, like the sound of a blind woman sitting in a cold shack, wanting to call her child but not having enough breath. She paused for a single beat. The funeral horn had also stopped to change tunes. The whole room went silent. In that silence, from behind the house, where a narrow path led past the old temple's columbarium, came the sound of dogs howling. Not one dog but many, a chain of howls rising from far away to near, then cutting off abruptly. Nam Hung's eyes darted toward the sound. Beyond the curtain of drizzle, the old temple crouched in the shadow of several dark saw trees. The columbarium door was slightly ajar. Inside it was pitch black, but she had the sensation that the dust-covered urns were quietly watching the funeral. A little later, someone from the family invited Nam Hung to rest and drink some water. She stood and walked to the back area. Her throat was so dry she had to drink several gulps of hot tea. The tea passing through her throat had a strange bitter taste, like incense smoke mixed with cold ashes. She spat lightly onto the ground and winced. Just then, a thin old man in faded brown clothes, holding a ring of keys, approached from the direction of the columbarium. The family called him Old Sao the Gloomy. He tended the temple and watched over the unclaimed bone urns. His eyes were still good, but because he had lived so long in the cold silence of the columbarium, people had given him that name after the ancient mung tree in the temple yard. Old Sao looked at Nam Hung for a long time. His gaze was not judgmental, but it made her uncomfortable. She set down her teacup and asked, flatly, "Why are you staring at me like that?" Old Sao the Gloomy stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You're the hired crier, aren't you?" Nam Hung curled her lip. "Everyone in this area knows. Does a hired crier offend your temple?" The old man was not offended. He looked toward Tam's coffin, then toward the dark columbarium where damp air rose faintly under the yellow light. He spoke quietly, as though to himself, "Crying for the dead is no sin. But using tears as a screen for the sins of the living, crying on command while your own conscience is hollow, be careful. One day the dead may borrow back that mouth." Nam Hung laughed sharply. The laugh scraped her throat the moment it left, sending a sharp pain through her. She rubbed her neck, her eyes hardening. "You're old, so you say creepy things. I cry for a living, whoever pays, I cry. If the dead have spirits, they know I helped make their funerals more dignified." Old Sao was silent for a few seconds. Then he raised his hand and pointed toward the columbarium. On a low brick shelf near the door sat a small urn that had been pushed slightly outward. In front of that urn, 3 fresh incense sticks were burning. No one knew who had lit them. The red tips glowed in the darkness, and all 3 were bent, curving directly toward Nam Hung, exactly like the 3 incense sticks on her mother's altar that morning. Nam Hung felt her chest tighten. Old Sao said very softly, "The incense here rarely bends. No one comes to tend these dead, sometimes a whole month goes by without a single stick being lit. Yet today, the moment you arrived, they burn as though a wind is blowing upward from underground." Nam Hung turned her face away, struggling to keep her voice normal. "Incense bends because of the damp and the wind, everything bends in this weather." Old Sao did not argue. He only looked at her, sad and deep. "There are those who die because no one remembers them. There are those who die because the living choose to forget. But there are also those who, even after dying, cannot leave, because there is one final call that no one is willing to hear." That sentence made Nam Hung suddenly remember her mother's voice in the rainy night, "Hung." The call brushed past her ears like cold air across the nape of her neck. She snapped at the old man to steady herself. "I still have to go back and cry. Don't stand here saying unlucky things." She turned and walked back toward the funeral tent. Old Sao the Gloomy remained where he was, the keys in his hand clinking softly, a tiny sound but cold. As Nam Hung passed the columbarium door, she heard a very faint knocking from inside. It was not the wind, and it was not rats. It sounded like an old woman's fingernail tapping the side of a ceramic urn. She did not stop. She walked faster, the white mourning cloth on her shoulder fluttering lightly in the drizzle. The second round of crying began when the family prepared for the final sealing of the coffin. Tam's body had been embalmed, only her face still visible under the thin white cloth. Nam Hung sat close, studying the dead woman's face. The skin was bluish-gray, the lips purple, the hair still faintly damp despite having been toweled dry. On her right wrist, near the palm, Nam-hung noticed a dark bruise shaped like a ring, the mark of a hand that had gripped her very hard. She froze. The image of her own mother's curled hand beside the broken rice bowl flashed through her mind. She immediately closed her eyes and forced herself deeper into the performance. She cried louder this time, her voice stretching out, long and desolate, pouring over the entire room like night rain. She called Tam by name, addressed her as a daughter, as a young woman cursed by fate. She told of how the deep river had stolen her away, of how the heavens could be so cruel. As she cried, she glanced at the family's reactions. The mother-in-law stood across the room, her face slightly tense, but the guests were already beginning to weep along. Just as she had planned, the more tragic the crying, the easier it was to bury the rumors under a layer of fake lamentation. Then something strange happened. Just as she leaned down close to the coffin and cried out, "Tam, if you suffered any injustice, come back and testify. Let the living feel their pity for you," a different voice burst from her own throat. That voice did not follow her breath. It cut in, hoarse, weak, trembling. Hung. Nam-hung went rigid. The crying that had been flowing seamlessly broke off abruptly. The people sitting nearby thought she had become so overwhelmed that she had choked. The hostess frowned and signaled her to keep going. Nam-hung swallowed, but her throat was dry and hard. She tried to draw another breath. This time the sound that came out was still her crying voice, but beneath it ran another layer, thick, hoarse, the sound of Mrs. Tulua, mixed with somewhere in it the muffled sobbing of a young woman. 3 voices stacked on top of each other, making the entire room feel as though needles were being pressed into the skin. The listeners could not distinguish them clearly, they only felt that the crying had suddenly become piercingly, unnervingly sad. But Nam-hung heard every word, very small, very close. "Child, your mother is cold. Your mother is hungry. You cry so beautifully for other people, why won't you cry even once for your mother?" Both of Nam-hung's hands began to shake. Her fingernails dug into the edge of the mat. Cold sweat ran down her spine. She wanted to stop, but she could not in front of the host family. She had already taken the money. People were watching. Her entire reputation of 20 years rested in this throat. She gritted her teeth, and tried to push her mother's voice down, tried to pull her own voice higher. She cried harder, more desperately, as though trying to drown out the real cry that was rising from the pit of her stomach with her own hired wailing. The whole tent erupted in grief. Someone began to hiccup with sobs. But Nam-hung grew paler. She felt that the voice in her mouth was no longer hers. It was the sound of a ceramic bowl shattering on a dirt floor, of rain dripping through a punctured tin roof, of a blind old mother calling her name in a lampless shack. When the ceremony paused, Nam-hung stood and her legs buckled. She had to grab a pillar for support. The mother-in-law stepped close and whispered in her ear, "Sister Hung, you cry so beautifully. Everyone praises you. Cry one more time when we take her to the grave, all right?" Nam-hung nodded but could not speak. She thought it was just exhaustion. She drank more tea, chewed some ginger that the family brought her, but her throat still ached as though being scraped with thorns. She sat in the corner of the tent, staring out at the rain. Not far away, the columbarium was silent in the darkness. The old wooden door had been closed, but from inside, a faint red glow still seeped out, like the tip of a burning incense stick. A while later, she saw old Sao the Gloomy emerge from the columbarium, his face ashen. He looked at her, then looked down at his own hand. In his palm was a handful of white bone ash, slightly damp. He walked toward her very slowly and told the family that one of the urns on the shelf had cracked open on its own. No one had touched it. The family members frowned and told him not to speak of unlucky things during a funeral. Old Sao said nothing more. But before turning away, he looked at Nam-hung, his voice so low that only she could hear. "Someone followed the sound of your crying back here." Nam-hung gripped the teacup in her hand. The tea was hot, but her palms were ice cold. She wanted to scold the old man, but the moment her lips parted, her throat locked shut again. Not a single sound came out. She coughed twice, dry, rasping, and instinctively brought her hand to her neck. Beneath the wrinkled skin at her Adam's apple, she felt something shift, very lightly, like a hiccup lying dormant, waiting for the right hour to surface. Near midnight, the funeral quieted. Guests thinned out. The western horn stopped. Family members took turns dozing on plastic chairs. Nam-hung was arranged to sleep temporarily on a wooden board near the back room, so she would be ready to cry during the graveside procession. She lay on her side, eyes wide open, staring at the yellow light bulb hanging under the tent canopy. Her throat ached, but what frightened her more was that every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shack behind her house, her mother sitting on the dirt floor, clouded eyes white, both hands clutching a bowl of cold rice, her lips moving, calling her name. Exactly at midnight, from the direction of Tam's coffin came a small dripping sound, water hitting the tiled floor, tap, tap. Then again. Nam-hung held her breath. She looked toward the central room. Below the coffin, a smear of muddy water was creeping slowly across the tiles, stretching into a line that pointed directly at where she lay. The smell of river water rose, cold and dank. At the same moment, inside her own throat, the hiccup from that afternoon stirred. She clapped her hand over her mouth, but from deep in her windpipe, an old, wet, cold voice still seeped through her fingers, so quietly that only she could hear. "Hung, dear, tomorrow when you take her to the grave, remember to cry loud and clear. Cry enough for your mother's share too." Nam-hung lay rigid on the wooden board until near dawn, both hands still clutching her throat, afraid that if she let go, that wet, shriveled voice would pour out of her mouth again. Under the funeral tent, the drizzle fell steadily, each drop tapping on the tarp with a soft plop, blending with the weakening generator and the tired breathing of those keeping the overnight vigil. Tam's coffin still rested in the central room. The red altar candles at either end burned low, their wax running down the candlesticks in thick, dark streaks, like congealed blood. The smell of river mud grew stronger, even though the floor had been wiped dry, even though the coffin was sealed, even though everyone said it was probably just the dampness rising from the canal in the rainy weather. Nam-hung could not fall asleep. Every time she drifted off, she saw a pair of withered hands groping in the darkness for a bowl of cold rice on a wet floor. Sometimes she heard the faint scratch of fingernails against a wall. Sometimes she heard her mother calling her name from behind her head. But when she opened her eyes, there was only the dull yellow bulb, the moths circling in loops and crashing into the light. She reassured herself that she was simply too tired, that her throat hurt from crying too much. The idea that her mother's voice had mixed into her crying was just a post-funeral hallucination. Her mother was dead and buried, dead people stayed in the ground. She had spent her whole life beside coffins, beside incense smoke. If she feared everything, how would she earn a living? Around 4 in the morning, the household began stirring, preparing for the graveside procession. The sound of a knife on a cutting board in the kitchen, the shuffle of slippers on the tile floor, people calling to each other to brew tea, set out food, arrange the wreaths. The funeral came back to life after a few hours of stillness. The hostess had someone bring Nam-hung a bowl of hot porridge and a cup of ginger tea. She sat up, her lips cracked, her throat raw as though scraped with thorns. She tried to clear her voice, the sound that emerged was thick and hoarse, lower than normal. She frowned, took a large gulp of tea. The hot liquid passed down her throat, but did not soothe the pain. It only gave her the sensation that something was blooming inside her windpipe, spreading, clinging to every fiber of flesh. The family member reminded her to get ready for the coffin crying segment, the most important part. When the dead left the house, the children had to wail loudly, and strangers had to feel the weight of the loss. Nam-hung knew that her fee, high or low, her reputation kept or lost, sometimes rested on just a few lines of crying as the coffin was carried through the doorway. She wiped her mouth, draped the white mourning cloth over her head, and walked toward the coffin. As she passed Tam's altar, she saw that the incense burner before the portrait was packed full of sticks. Among them, 3 were bending, not outward as wind might push but inward. Their red tips pointed straight at her throat. Nam-hung froze. Tam's portrait under the lamplight looked different from the night before. The eyes in the photograph seemed wetter, deeper, staring at her without blinking. She was about to turn away when she heard behind her the sound of a young woman crying, a single muffled sob. She thought it was someone from the family, but when she looked around, no one was crying. The women were adjusting their mourning clothes. The men were checking the coffin poles. The sob came and went in an instant, leaving only a cold breath against the back of her neck. Nam-hung pulled the mourning cloth across half her face, hiding her pallor. When the coffin lid was covered with the final white cloth, Tam's mother-in-law stepped close, pressed near Hung's ear, and said in a small, hard voice, "Sister Hung, when you cry later, remember not to say any of those words about injustice. People are spreading rumors, our family doesn't want to hear more of it. Just cry that Tam was unlucky, that she slipped into the river, that fate called and she had to go." Nam-hung looked at her, beneath the thin powder, the woman's cheekbones were tight, her eyes dry and cold. Nam-hung had seen many faces like this at wealthy funerals. They feared the dead less than they feared gossip. They feared the coffin in their home less than they feared the world outside their gate. She had taken their money, so she understood the rule of silence in her profession. She nodded, but her throat hurt too much to say anything. The sound that came out was a hoarse mm. The moment that sound left her, she heard a very faint laugh inside her own ear. Not a happy laugh, a laugh choked in water. The laugh of a young woman who had been pushed into a river and then surfaced one final time. She spun around toward the coffin. Behind it, the white funeral curtain hung nearly to the floor. On the tile beneath it, a smear of muddy water was spreading. In that smear the clear imprint of bare feet appeared, small, the toes pointing toward the door. The footprints were wet and distinct at first, then faded before reaching the yard. Nam-hung looked around. No one was paying attention. Everyone was busy with the rituals, busy performing their grief, busy keeping the funeral dignified. When it was time to carry the coffin, 4 strong men stepped in and lifted it. The sound of the carrying poles settling on their shoulders was heavy. Nam-hung knelt at the head of the coffin, both hands striking the tiled floor, drawing breath to cry, but the breath rose into her throat and seized. She gritted her teeth and forced the sound out. This time the crying that burst forth was powerful but strange. It was no longer under her control, as it had always been. It was partly the professional wailing of Nam-hung, partly the hoarse, thick voice of Mrs. Tu Lua, and mixed in somewhere, the muffled sobbing of a young woman. 3 voices braided together, making the entire room feel as though needles were being pressed into the skin. The people in the tent heard it and went pale. Some thought Nam-hung had become so deeply immersed in her role that she had broken down completely. But old Sao the gloomy, standing on the porch, pressed his hands together before his chest, eyes on the ground, lips moving as though reciting a prayer. Nam-hung cried while her insides churned with panic. Her mouth called Tam's name, but the voice that emerged sometimes shifted to mother. She meant to cry, "Tam, you've left home now, it's so cold." But her throat tripped and warped it into, "Mother, you're lying in the cold earth now." The listeners thought she was comparing the dead woman to her own mother, and they were even more moved. The hostess frowned, but the guests were already crying along, so she did not dare stop it. The more Nam-hung tried to correct herself, the more her crying slid away from her intention. It was as though someone stood behind her, gripping the back of her neck, forcing her to call out the things she had buried. The coffin was carried out of the house. The drizzle fell on the white cloth covering the lid, soaking into small gray spots. The road to the cemetery on Ton Fu Island passed right by the temple's columbarium. The procession moved slowly, the soft slap of slippers on wet ground, the funeral horn playing a long, mournful phrase among the water hyacinths. Nam-hung walked close behind the coffin, still crying at each stage. Her throat hurt so much that every sound that emerged felt as though it were dragging a serrated blade. But she could not stop. The family had paid. The crowd was listening. Her entire life had depended on this mouth. Never before had it felt so alien to her. As the funeral procession passed the columbarium door, a cold gust of wind blew out from inside. The old wooden door pushed open a little wider on its own, its hinges groaning long and low. Nam-hung glanced inside. On the brick shelves, the dust-covered urns sat in silent rows. The cracked urn from the night before had been set in a corner by old Sao, its mouth loosely covered with a scrap of white cloth. But as Tam's coffin passed by, that scrap of cloth bulged upward, as though a breath from inside was pushing it. A little white bone ash drifted down, spreading on the ground in the shape of outstretched fingertips. In front of each row of urns, incense sticks had appeared, no one knew when, all burning, all bending in the same direction, their red tips drooping, as though dozens of forgotten dead had simultaneously turned their faces toward Nam-hung. She stumbled. The person behind her caught her arm and asked softly, "Are you all right, Sister Hung?" She shook her head but could not answer. Inside her throat, her mother's voice rose again, clearer this time, closer, as though Mrs. Tulua were standing right beside her ear, murmuring, "You cry so beautifully for them, but your mother's grave, have you even lit a single stick of incense to warm it, child?" Nam-hung pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to turn the hiccup into a crying sound. The procession moved on. No one noticed that under her hem, mud clung to her pants in long streaks. Even though the brick road was fairly clean, the mud had the smell of a freshly dug grave, of old damp cloth, and of scorched cold rice. The cemetery of Councilman Trake's family sat on a raised piece of land near the river's edge. Beetle palms and red hibiscus grew around it, but because of the rain, the fallen flowers covered the ground, their petals trampled into the mud like smears of red ink. Tam's grave had been pre-dug. Nam-hung stood at the head of the pit, her face ashen, her lips purplish. As the coffin was lowered, the sound of the ropes rubbing against the wooden edges made a squealing noise that reminded her of her own mother's burial. The same wet soil, the same drizzle, the same sound of wood being swallowed by earth. But Tam's funeral had 100 people, musicians, wreaths, a hired crier. Her own mother, the woman who had struggled through an entire life of poverty to raise her, had only a few handfuls of cold earth and a neighbor's tears. That thought flashed through her mind, and Nam-hung immediately pushed it away. She did not want to be soft. Softness was weakness. Weakness meant being trampled. She had once been poor, once been looked down upon, once seen how people with money were respected. She told herself she had done what was necessary to survive. Her mother was old, sick, dead, it was only a matter of time. But the moment she finished telling herself that, the incense stick planted at the head of Tam's grave suddenly bent down sharply. Its red tip nearly touched the ground, and the ash fell straight into a puddle of muddy water at Nam-hung's toes, hissing with a thin wisp of smoke. In that wisp of smoke, she glimpsed, just for an instant, the face of Mrs. Tulua, clouded eyes, lips moving without sound. Nam-hung let out a scream. The crowd thought she had reached the climax of her grieving. She collapsed at the edge of the grave, both hands clawing at the wet soil, her crying pouring out without stopping. But this time, even she could not tell whether she was crying on higher for Tam, or whether her mother was forcing her to weep before the eyes of the world. She cried until her voice broke, until she coughed up a mixture of blood and saliva. The hostess, alarmed that the guests might see something wrong, quickly sent someone to pull her away. People praised Nam-hung. She cried with such heart, she coughed blood for the poor girl. But Nam-hung heard those words and her teeth chattered. For the first time, the fee in her pocket felt as heavy as a stone tied around her neck. After the grave was filled, Nam-hung was taken back to Councilman Trake's house to rest. The hostess paid her extra, saying a few perfunctory words of thanks. "Thanks to you, sister, the funeral went smoothly. Take care of your health, if we need you again, we'll call." On any other occasion, Nam-hung would have smiled, taken the money, and offered a polite pleasantry. But today she only held the envelope, her lips moving without producing a sound. Her throat felt as though it had been cinched shut with a wet cord. She tried to say thank you, but what came out was only a dry rustle, like ash falling inside an empty urn. The hostess thought she was simply exhausted, and did not press the matter. Only old Sao the gloomy, standing under the porch eaves, watched her for a very long time. When everyone had dispersed, he stepped close and pressed a small packet wrapped in gold paper into her hand. Nam-hung opened it. Inside was a pinch of white bone ash and 3 crooked incense stubs. She flinched and almost threw it back, but Old Sow spoke first, his voice sinking low. I picked this up in front of the columbarium. I don't know whose it is, but it fell exactly where you were standing. Take it back and burn incense for them. Don't let the dead keep borrowing a living person's voice, it's a sin for both sides. Nam-hung stared at him. She wanted to curse, to tell him to stop frightening her, to say that she didn't need anyone teaching her about the dead. But her throat was locked. Not a single word could pass through. She could only grip the gold paper packet tightly, her fingernails pressing into her own palm until it hurt. Old Sow sighed, turned and walked back toward the temple. His thin figure receded into the drizzle, and behind him the columbarium sat cold and dark, those ceramic urns still and silent, as though guarding hundreds of cries that had never been heard by anyone. Late that afternoon, Nam-hung headed back to Kaduk. On the boat, she sat alone at the bow, the envelope of money hidden inside her blouse, Old Sow's gold paper packet tucked in her bag. The river was vast, the sky low and gray, the wind cutting across her face like a blade. The boatman asked if she wanted to stop at the market to buy anything. She opened her mouth to answer, but only a hoarse breath emerged. The boatman looked at her and grinned. Sister Hung cried so hard she lost her voice. Huh? This job looks easy but it's rough. Nam-hung tried to smile back, but the smile came out crooked. She reached up and felt her throat. Beneath the skin, the lump from the night before was still there, motionless, like a person curled up and waiting for dark. When she got home, the first thing she did was put the money away. That habit was stronger than fear. She opened the cabinet, stuffed the envelope into the bottom drawer, then stood for a long time before her mother's altar. Mrs. Tu's portrait was veiled in a thin layer of incense smoke. The bowl of rice from that morning had dried hard, but the depression on one side was still there, deeper than the day before. Next to the rice bowl, a thin smear of murky water had appeared, stretching from the edge of the altar to the tiled floor, as though water had dripped from someone's wet shirt. Nam-hung's hands trembled as she took 3 new incense sticks. She tried to light them with a lighter, but the flame flickered and died repeatedly, leaving only the acrid smell of gas. She grew frustrated, threw the lighter onto the table, and opened her mouth to curse, but the curse did not come out. Her throat was sealed shut. She opened her mouth wide, straining to push out even a single word. Her face turned red, her eyes bulged, the veins in her neck stood out. Nothing. Only a dry, hollow breath. She panicked, slapped her own throat, ran to the kitchen to drink water, gargled with salt water, still nothing. The house fell into a silence that was wrong. Outside the canal, night had fully fallen. Wind blew through the banana grove behind the garden, making the torn leaves slap together with a constant rattle. From the empty shack where Mrs. Tulua had lived, the old corrugated tin creaked again, click-clack, as though someone were shifting their weight on the wooden platform. Nam-hung stood in the middle of the house, eyes wide, mouth open in helpless silence. She had cried for strangers for more than 20 years. She had earned money with this throat. She had made countless people believe that her tears were real. And now, in her own house, before the altar of the mother who had just died, she could not produce a single sound. The moment she lurched toward the altar, the 3 unlit incense sticks in her hand snapped in half. The broken tips fell to the floor, arranging themselves in a curved line, like 3 shriveled fingers. She looked down, her face drained of blood. From behind her mother's portrait, a very faint breath of sound emerged, dry, weak, but so close it seemed to blow directly onto her face. And then, inside her already sealed throat, a small hiccup stirred on its own. Not a cry, not a wail, just enough to signal that something in there had not disappeared at all. It was only waiting for 12 midnight. Nam-hung stood frozen before her mother's altar until her knees began to shake. In the house, the yellow electric light cast harsh shadows on the old tiled floor, illuminating the 3 broken incense sticks at her feet, like small fragments of bone that someone had snapped apart. She crouched to pick them up, but the moment her fingers touched them, the tips crumbled to black dust, packing under her fingernails. The smell was not like normal incense ash, it was sharp and cold, laced with the scent of grave dirt and cold ashes, exactly like the smell inside the old columbarium behind the temple on Tanfu Island. She wiped her hand on her blouse, opened her mouth to call out, to break the fear, but her throat remained shut. Not a single sound emerged, even though she strained until her face flushed red. For the first time in her life, Nam-hung understood what it meant to experience a terrifying silence. Other mute people could use their hands to compensate, could use their eyes to beg. But her muteness was like a cold lock clamped around her windpipe, sealing shut every sound she had once used to earn money, to overpower others, to cry for the world. She pounded her chest, coughed repeatedly, but even the coughing was only a dry rasp through her teeth. She ran to the kitchen, rummaged for medicinal oil, scraped some ginger, mixed it with hot water and drank. The ginger liquid burned down her throat and made her eyes water, but the windpipe did not open. It grew heavier by the hour, as though a handful of wet ash were swelling inside, blocking every passage of air. Outside, the neighborhood of Ka-duk had sunk into night. The houses along the canal had turned off their lights early, only a few small bulbs glowed through door cracks. The sound of water lapping against the wooden bridge posts came in regular, hollow thuds. In the distance, a late-running boat engine growled, its sound fading and dissolving into the darkness. Nam-hung sank onto a chair, both hands clutching her throat. Before her, Mrs. Tu's portrait gazed out from a thin veil of smoke, those clouded eyes, opaque and still, yet somehow tonight they seemed deeper, sadder, as though waiting for a word that the living could no longer speak. She tried to avoid looking at the altar. She stood and paced. At one point she opened the cabinet, took out the money and counted it, her habit whenever she felt uneasy. The paper bills, smoothed flat under the light, stacked into neat piles. The money was still there, thick and real. But the rustling of paper tonight made her flinch, like the sound of burial shrouds rubbing together. She thought of the envelope the hostess had pressed into her hand, of the guests praising her crying, of the moment she had knelt by the grave and coughed up blood. Then the image of her own mother surfaced, lying on her side on the wooden platform, hand curled beside the broken bowl. She shoved the money back into the cabinet and slammed the drawer shut. But the sound of the drawer closing in the empty house was exactly like the sound of a coffin lid being sealed. Near 10 o'clock, Mrs. Hai Shuyan from next door came over. She had seen Nam-hung's light still on and, thinking of Mrs. Tu's recent death, brought over a bowl of mung bean porridge. She stood at the door and called out several times. Nam-hung heard and felt a surge of relief, like a drowning person catching a branch. She rushed to open the door, her lips moving, both hands pointing at her own throat. Mrs. Hai started, stared at Nam-hung's ashen face, and asked softly, "You've really lost your voice, Hung. I heard the boatman say so this afternoon. I thought you were just hoarse from crying too much." Nam-hung nodded frantically, her lips trembling, eyes reddening with a mixture of fear and frustration. She tried to produce a sound, but her throat only moved in a dry, useless spasm. Mrs. Hai set the porridge on the table and glanced at Mrs. Tu's altar. She saw the caved-in rice bowl, the bent incense ash, and was silent for a very long time. That silence made Nam-hung uncomfortable. If she could still speak, she would have snapped, "Stop looking at me like that." But now she could only stand there, breathing hard, both hands squeezing her throat. Mrs. Hai stepped to the altar and straightened the water offering. Her voice was slow and sad. "Let me tell you this, if you can hear it, hear it. Your mother didn't need much when she was alive. She only wanted you to bring her a hot meal, to sit beside her for a little while, to say one word to warm her heart. Old blind people suffer so much, they can't see their children's faces, so they live on the sound of their children's voices. In those last months, every time I brought porridge over, she would ask, 'Has Hung come home yet? Is she crying far away today, Sister Hai?' She never blamed you. Not once." Nam-hung turned her face away. Her throat hurt again, but not from the muteness. It ached as though someone were pressing the exact softest spot inside her chest. She did not want to listen. She did not want to remember. She had trained herself to believe that her mother was old, sick, dead. It was inevitable. She had struggled too hard to get this brick house, this reputation, this money that made people respect her. She could not let a few words of sympathy drag her back to the days of poverty, the days she and her mother had huddled together in that leaking shack, eating rice mixed with rainwater. But the more she pushed the memories away, the clearer they became. She saw her mother in her youth, carrying 2 hanging baskets across a swaying monkey bridge, her shirt soaked with sweat. She saw her mother sitting under an oil lamp, patching a school uniform for her. She saw her mother's hand feeding her spoonful by spoonful when she had a high fever, blowing on each mouthful, whispering, "Eat, child, your mother is right here." Mrs. Hai saw Nam Hung trembling and sighed. She placed a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "Tonight, light some incense for her peace, cook a bowl of hot rice and put it on the altar. Whatever wrong you've done, say it in your heart, that works too. The dead hear your heart, not just your mouth." With that, Mrs. Hai left. The door closed and the house sank back into silence. Nam Hung stood in the middle of the room, listening to Mrs. Hai's footsteps fade on the wet path. The drizzle resumed. She looked at the bowl of porridge on the table, its thin steam rising, the fragrance of mung beans, fried shallots, the smell of a living person's kitchen. Unbidden, she remembered that rainy afternoon, her mother asking only for a bowl of hot rice, and her tossing her a bowl of cold leftovers splashed with fish sauce before going off to cry for strangers. She reached out and picked up the porridge bowl, intending to place it on her mother's altar. But as she stepped forward, she saw the old bowl of rice on the altar shudder slightly. A single dried grain rolled off the surface, traveled to the edge of the table and stopped. She froze. Gathering her courage, she removed the old rice bowl and replaced it with the hot porridge. She lit the incense using the oil lamp, this time the flame caught immediately. 3 red tips glowed. She planted them in the burner, pressed her hands together, her lips moving without sound. Inside her, she tried to say the words "I'm sorry," but those words were dry and rigid, they would not flow. She looked at her mother's photograph, at the bowl of porridge, at the incense smoke rising. At first the smoke rose straight, then, gradually, all 3 sticks began to bend. Their red tips did not droop toward the porridge, nor toward the portrait. They bent straight toward Nam Hung's mouth. The smoke pressed against her face, stinging her eyes until they watered. She stepped back, her hand knocking against her bag. The gold paper packet from Old Sao the Gloomy fell to the floor and tore open. The white bone ash inside spilled out, spreading in a thin line across the tiles. The 3 crooked incense stubs rolled to the base of the altar. Nam Hung looked down, her face bloodless. The ash did not lie still. In the draft from the door crack, it gathered into a long streak, like the mark of a hand sweeping across the floor. She grabbed a broom to sweep it up, but the moment the bristles touched it, the ash rose in a small cloud that clung to her lips, her nostrils, her throat. She coughed violently in her voiceless state, her eyes bloodshot. The taste of the ash was bitter and cold, exactly like the tea at Tam's funeral, exactly like the air inside the columbarium, where the unclaimed urns sat gathering dust. She looked at the clock on the wall. The minute hand crept past 11. Less than an hour until midnight. She did not understand why she feared 12 o'clock so much. For her entire life, she had stayed awake through countless funeral nights. She had sat beside coffins from the first watch to the third, had heard the dead twitch inside their wooden casings, had heard dogs howling in the cemetery, had seen altar candles extinguish themselves during prayer chants. She had been able to explain all of those things, to brush them off, to turn them into a story she could tell for extra money. But tonight was different. Tonight the terror was not outside in the yard, not inside a coffin, not in the columbarium. It was inside her throat. She wrapped a scarf tightly around her neck, once, twice, 3 times. She pulled it tight until her face flushed, trying to seal off the passage of whatever was hiding inside. She pulled a chair up and sat directly before her mother's altar, eyes staring at the clock. 11:30. 11:40. 11:50. The ticking of the clock in the empty house sounded abnormally loud, each tick like a water drop hitting the bottom of an empty jar. Behind the garden, the empty shack where Mrs. Two had lived occasionally emitted its creaking sound. There was no strong wind, yet the old leaf door still banged against the wall in slow, deliberate thuds, as though a blind person were feeling their way to the house. Exactly at 12, the oil lamp on the altar flickered once and went dark. The house plunged into blackness. Only the 3 red incense tips remained, bent and crooked, flickering in the dark like 3 tiny eyes. Nam-hung leapt to her feet, both hands clutching her throat. The scarf wrapped around her neck had suddenly turned ice cold. From deep in her throat, a wet sound rose. It did not ask her permission. It did not need her breath. It crawled up on its own, slowly, deliberately, as surely as someone pushing up through the earth of a grave. She gritted her teeth and clamped her hand over her mouth, but the hiccup still passed through her fingers. At first it was only a hoarse groan. Then it lengthened into a cry. That cry was wet, choked, thick and trembling. It did not ring out like her hired wailing, it was thin and weak, but it ached so deeply it made the listener's bones go cold. Nam-hung collapsed to the tiled floor, her back arching, her eyes rolling. And from her mouth, her own mouth, Mrs. Tulua's voice emerged, clear as day. "Hung, child, your mother is so cold, your mother is so hungry. You cry for the whole neighborhood to hear, why won't you cry even once for your mother, child?" Nam-hung shook her head wildly. Tears poured from her eyes, not from wanting to cry, but from terror, from the pain in her throat, from a body that had been hijacked by another's voice. She scrambled backward on the floor, hitting her back against the table leg. The bowl of porridge on the altar tilted but did not fall. On the still hot surface of the porridge, a small depression appeared, then another, as though several bony fingertips had just scooped up a pinch of rice. The crying in her throat grew more desperate. It called Hung's name over and over, sometimes reproachful, sometimes pleading, sometimes shivering as though the speaker were crouching in the rain. She raked her fingernails across her own neck until she drew blood, but her mother's voice did not stop. The neighboring house clicked on its light, then another. Mrs. Hai Shuyan ran over first, throwing a raincoat over her shoulders, a flashlight in her hand. The moment she reached the yard, she stopped. The crying coming from inside Nam-hung's house did not sound like a living person's voice. It came from Nam-hung's mouth, but it also seemed to echo from the shack behind the garden, and from deep underground near the freshly dug grave behind the temple. Mrs. Hai's legs went weak. She pushed the door. In the flashlight beam, she saw Nam-hung kneeling before the altar, both hands gripping her throat, mouth wide open, tears and mucus streaming down her face, but the voice coming out was Mrs. Tulua's. That voice sobbed and choked, "Sister Hai, I'm hungry." I called her, but she went to cry for other people. Mrs. Hai dropped the flashlight. The light rolled across the floor, sweeping over the spilled white bone ash from the gold paper packet. On the damp floor, the ash had clumped into long streaks, like the marks of an old woman crawling on her hands and knees from the door to the altar. The neighbors standing in the yard heard Mrs. Two's name called in a dead woman's voice, and every face went pale. Some pressed their hands together and bowed. Some grabbed their children and ran home. The black dog slithered under the platform, howled once, then went silent, as if its own throat had been squeezed shut. Mrs. Hai, trembling, stepped forward to help Nam-hung, but the moment she touched her shoulder, she yanked her hand back. Nam-hung's body was ice cold, not the cold of illness, but the cold of a corpse that had just been wiped with rainwater. The crying from Nam-hung's throat continued. Now another voice mingled in, a young woman's, wet and distant, as though drifting up from the riverbed. "They hired you to cover up their crime. You cried so beautifully, but fake tears can't cover cold earth." No one in the neighborhood dared step inside. Nam-hung knelt there before her mother's altar, crying in voices that did not belong to her, until nearly 3 in the morning. When the crying finally stopped, her body crumpled to the floor. Her throat emitted a single dry click, then went silent. Mrs. Hai and several men from the neighborhood had to carry her to her bed. She was still alive, her eyes were open, her lips moving, but she still could not speak. Around her neck, the scratches she had inflicted on herself had dried into thin red lines. And before Mrs. Two's altar, the 3 incense sticks had burned to nothing. Their ash had not fallen, it had curled into the shape of a crooked, open mouth, crying. The next morning, the news that Nam Hung had been possessed by her dead mother's voice spread throughout Ka Duk. People discussed it at the market, at the dock, in the roadside coffee shops. Some said she had been struck by a malevolent spirit after the funeral on the island. Some said the ghost of Tam, who had died unjustly, had followed her home. But those who had heard the voice with their own ears at midnight did not dare speak loudly, because that voice could not be faked. It was the voice of Mrs. Tulua, a blind old woman who had lived in silence in a shack, who had accepted bowls of porridge from a neighbor, who had defended her daughter to the very end, only to be abandoned in hunger and cold. Nam Hung sat on her bed, hair disheveled, neck wrapped in a scarf, eyes hollow and dark-ringed. Visitors came, she only looked at them, her lips moving soundlessly. The reputation of the finest hired crier in the region had, in a single night, become a story that made everyone's blood run cold. No wealthy family dared hire her anymore. No one wanted her voice, the voice of a hired mourner that suddenly emitted the cries of a mother who had died of hunger, anywhere near their funerals. That afternoon, someone from Councilman Trake's family even sent a person to return the mourning cloth Nam Hung had left behind. They did not enter the house. They left the cloth at the gate and hurried away, as though the muteness itself were contagious. That evening, Ka Duk neighborhood shut its doors earlier than usual. The closest neighbors moved their altars inside and burned incense in prayer. Mrs. Hai Shuyan warned her children never to run past Nam Hung's yard. And Nam Hung, after an entire day without producing a single word, sat again before her mother's altar. She had cooked a bowl of hot rice, added a dish of braised fish, a bowl of vegetable soup, a glass of warm water. This time everything was more complete than it had ever been when her mother was alive. But strangely, the more complete it was, the colder the house felt. She pressed her hands together, her lips trembling, trying to apologize. No sound came out, only tears falling onto the back of her hand, hot and salty. The clock ticked toward midnight. She looked at the 3 fresh incense sticks on the altar. They began to bend again, slowly, gradually. Their red tips drooped toward her. She shrank back, her spine pressing against the wall. From the shack behind the garden, the old wooden platform creaked again, click-clack, click-clack. And from deep in her throat, the familiar hiccup stirred once more. But this time, before the crying could emerge, her 2 hands rose on their own. She stared at them in horror, her face contorting. They trembled violently, then slowly, deliberately, slapped her across the face. The slap rang out, dry and sharp, in the empty house. Her cheek burned. She tried to lower her hands, but could not control them. They rose again, slowly, as though an invisible thread were pulling them from above. Outside the yard, the canal wind blew through the banana grove, making the torn leaves slap and rattle. The empty shack behind the garden was pitch black, its leaf door half closed, but the wooden platform inside still creaked in steady rhythm, as though someone had just sat down. And from her throat, her mother's voice emerged, choked and cold, "Cry, child. Cry with your true heart. Cry so your mother can hear you just once." The first slap made Nam Hung's vision swim. She toppled to one side, but both knees stayed locked to the floor as though nailed there. Her left cheek burned. She opened her mouth to scream for help, but her throat remained sealed, only a short, broken breath escaped, like a fish thrown onto a riverbank. Her right hand lowered, then slowly rose again, not following her will, not following her strength, but pulled by something invisible. Outside, the wind from the canal swept through the banana leaves, making the torn fronds crash and snap. The shack behind the garden was dark, its leaf door half closed, but the wooden platform inside creaked on, and with each creak, her hand rose higher. She stared at her own hands in disbelief. The fingers were clenched, the nails digging into her palms until they turned white. Then the second slap came down, harder this time. The sound was dry and sharp before her mother's altar, making the water cup shiver slightly, making the 3 crooked incense sticks on the burner flare red for a single instant. And from her throat, Mrs. Tulua's voice burst forth, wet, choked, but no longer weak as it had been the night before. It had found the path. It had grown accustomed to this body. It knew how to use Nam Hung's breath to cry. When I was alive, I called your name once and you said I was a nuisance. I asked for a bowl of hot rice, and you gave me cold leftovers. Now cry, cry with the same mouth you sold to the whole world. Nam Hung shook her head violently. Tears poured from her eyes. She did not know whether they were her own tears or her dead mother's. Her face twisted, her lips trembled, saliva ran down her chin. She grabbed her right wrist with her left hand, trying to hold it back, but the left hand was pulled up too. The 2 hands alternated, left, right, each slap measured, heavy, cold, like a sentence no one read aloud. The sound of flesh striking flesh rang out one after another in the empty house, woven between the crackle of burning incense, and the wind whistling through the door cracks. Mrs. Hai Shuyan next door heard the commotion and sat up. She had not been sleeping well anyway, ever since the first night of hearing Mrs. Tu's voice come from Nam Hung's house. Every time she dozed she saw the blind old woman sitting on the edge of her bed, both hands clutching an empty bowl. Tonight, hearing the repeated slaps, she threw on a coat, grabbed a flashlight and ran over. But when she reached the gate, she did not dare enter immediately. Inside the house, Mrs. Tu's crying voice was still coming through, rising and falling, and the slaps continued in steady rhythm, as though someone were forcing a living person to pay a debt one blow at a time. Mrs. Hai stood on the porch and called out, her voice shaking, Hung. Open the door, let me see what you're doing in there. There was no answer from Nam Hung, only the voice of the dead woman echoing from inside, Sister Hai, don't come in. Let me teach my child to cry. She's cried for other people long enough, she hasn't cried for me yet. Mrs. Hai's legs gave out. The flashlight in her hand shook so badly that its beam danced across the wooden door, across the wet yard, and settled on a smear of mud before the doorstep. That smear stretched from the shack behind the garden all the way to the front door. In the mud, the marks of an old woman's hand were visible, the fingers curled and uneven, like a blind person supporting herself as she crawled through the dark. Mrs. Hai clapped her hand over her mouth, staggered back several steps, and ran to summon the men of the neighborhood. By the time the neighbors arrived, the slapping inside had not stopped. A man named Tam Loy rammed the door with his shoulder. It burst open, and the smell of burnt incense, cold sweat, fresh blood, and damp ash rushed out, making everyone recoil. In the center of the house, Nam Hung knelt before her mother's altar, her silk blouse disheveled, her hair loose and half covering her face. Both cheeks were swollen, the corners of her lips were split, blood running in lines down her chin. But her 2 hands were still raised, rising and falling, as though controlled by another will. On the altar, Mrs. Tu's portrait was clouded with incense smoke, but the clouded eyes in the photograph seemed to glow with a cold light. Tam Loy grabbed Nam Hung's wrists to restrain her. The moment he touched her skin, he jerked his hand back. Her wrists were ice cold, as though she had been soaked in frozen water. Nam Hung raised her face and looked at everyone. Her eyes were bloodshot, but deep inside them was the pleading of someone trapped inside her own body. Her lips trembled violently, and from her throat, Mrs. Tu's voice rose again, quieter now, but aching to the bone, don't hold her. When I was lying in the cold, did anyone hold her hand? When I was hungry, did anyone make her come back? No one. No one dared step forward. Mrs. Hai Shuyan broke down in tears, pressed her hands together, and looked up at the altar. Sister Tu, if you love her, let her go. She was wrong, let me take her to a doctor, don't let her die like this. Sister Tu, please. At the words, let her go, Nam Hung's entire body collapsed. Both hands finally dropped. She lay on her side on the tile floor, breathing in ragged gasps, blood and tears mingling on her face. But the voice in her throat still had not stopped. It seeped out in broken phrases, like an old woman who had cried until her breath was nearly gone. I don't want her to die. I only want her to remember. Remember that rainy night. Remember the bowl of cold rice. Remember me calling your name outside the door. Hearing that, Nam-hung suddenly convulsed. Her eyes flew open wide, and her throat produced a dry clicking sound. She wanted to deny it, wanted to shake her head, wanted to say it wasn't true, but no words came. Everything she had buried with her mother's cheap coffin now rose to the surface like silt churned up by a storm, layer by layer, net by net. She remembered that night very clearly. It was not that she hadn't known her mother was still breathing. It was not that she hadn't heard her mother calling. When she had returned from the funeral across the river, she had seen her mother lying on the shack floor, one hand clutching her stomach, the other groping toward the door. Her breath was as faint as a dying flame. She had stood there and looked at her mother. She had heard her mother's lips moving, calling her name. But outside in the yard, a representative of the host family was waiting. They wanted to give her extra money because she had cried so beautifully, and they had another funeral the next day they wanted to hire her for. She had turned away and accepted the envelope first. When she turned back, her mother was cold. That memory drove into her like a needle. She curled into a ball, both hands clutching her head, tears streaming out. But the crying that erupted from her throat was not her own. It was Mrs. Tulua's voice, crying in place of her unfilial daughter. The voice was old, exhausted, like wind blowing through a shack where no one lived anymore. The neighbors stood in a circle, all silent. That silence was heavier than any accusation, because in that silence, everyone understood that there were things they had only suspected before, but now had been spoken aloud by the throat of the person who had committed them. After that night, Nam-hung's house was no longer a place anyone dared walk past alone after dark. By day it still stood there, brick walls, tin roof, wooden door, altar, small yard. But as soon as the sun set, a coldness would seep out from the shack behind the garden, slowly penetrating the floor, the walls, every crack in the door. The faint smell of cold leftover rice would drift on the wind, even though Mrs. Hai Shuyan had cleaned out the shack, buried the broken bowl by the banana roots, and burned Mrs. Tu's old clothes to send them to the dead. The children in the neighborhood started running past Nam-hung's house at top speed on their way home from school. They said they saw an old woman with silver hair sitting at the shack door, her eyes white and clouded, holding a bowl, her face turned toward the brick house. Every night at 12, the crying would begin again. At first it was only Mrs. Tu's voice. A few days later, a young woman's voice mingled in, wet and muffled, hiccuping and choking. I didn't fall in the river. I didn't go willingly. They pushed me. They hired you to shut the living mouths. Some nights there were even more voices, old, young, male, female, all rumbling together, as though emanating from the dust-covered urns in the columbarium across the river. The unclaimed dead, the faded names on red paper, the people who had died without being remembered, all of them seemed to have been drawn back by the sound of the hired crying, crowding in to demand one true cry of genuine pain. The neighborhood could not bear it. The closest families moved out to stay with relatives for a few days and never came back. The woman who sold noodle soup at the bridgehead moved her stall down to the market. The night boats that usually moored near Nam-hung's dock avoided it, because at midnight, the crying would mix with the sound of water slapping the hull. Some people said that crying could sober a drunk man. Others said that after hearing it, they went home and couldn't sleep because they suddenly thought of their own mothers. But there were also those who grew sick from fear, because amid the heartbreaking wailing, there were phrases that called the names of the living, the exact names of those who had abandoned their parents, who had fought over land, who had buried their loved ones in haste to save money. Nam-hung, after nights like those, grew gaunt. By day she was mute and unsteady, her eyes permanently dark-circled. She tried to write on paper to ask for help, but her hand shook so badly that the characters were illegible. Every time she tried to write the two words "I'm sorry," the pen would jam and the ink would bleed into curved lines, like the marks of bent incense ash. She could not eat. Every time she brought a bowl of rice to her lips, she retched, because in her throat there was the taste of scorched cold rice, of old fish sauce, of rainwater dripping through a punctured tin roof. Finally, Mrs. Hai Shuyan made the difficult journey across to Tan Fu Island to find Old Sao the Gloomy. The old man listened to the whole story without surprise. He only sat for a very long time before the columbarium, looking at the silent ceramic urns on their shelves. That afternoon, he crossed back to Kaduk by boat, bringing a bundle of incense, a small bell, a handful of rice and salt, and a yellowed sheet of paper. The moment he stepped into the yard, he stopped before the shack behind the garden. The leaf door was half closed. Inside, there was no one, yet the old wooden platform was swaying gently, creaking in a slow rhythm, as though an old woman had just sat down to wait. Old Sao pressed his hands together and bowed toward the shack, then entered the house. Nam Hung was sitting before her mother's altar. When she saw him, she lunged forward and grabbed the hem of his trousers, her mouth open, her eyes pleading, but no sound emerged. Old Sao looked at her throat. The scratch marks had scabbed over in dark lines, but around her Adam's apple there was a bruised purple ring, curved like an invisible cord cinched tight. He sighed. The mouth you used to cry for strangers, now the dead have borrowed it back. To repay, it's not enough to just make a big show. You have to repay with the truth. Nam Hung shook her head, tears falling to the floor. Old Sao placed the yellowed paper on the table. It was a list of names of the unclaimed urns in the old columbarium. But at the bottom, a new line had been added in hurried writing, the name of Tam. Beside it, a few words in a trembling hand, written by a laborer who had secretly told Old Sao that on the night Tam died, someone had seen her husband and mother-in-law dragging her out to the back garden. She had been pregnant. After that, they heard only a loud splash near the dock. The next morning, her body surfaced near the temple. The family said she slipped. Money was sent to many people. The funeral was held on a grand scale, and Nam Hung was hired to cry convincingly, to drape fake tears over a real death. Mrs. Hai Shuyan listened and gasped. She looked at Nam Hung. Nam Hung collapsed to the floor, her shoulders shaking. Her throat produced a dry clicking sound, as though she were trying to vomit up a lump. Old Sao continued, his voice deep and sad, Tam's injustice doesn't fall entirely on you. You were only the hired crier. What's heavier is that you used your crying to cover the sins of the living, while your own mother died for lack of a single bowl of hot rice. Those two things met in one mouth. And so every night, it has to cry. Hearing that, Nam Hung began to bang her head on the floor. A dull thud echoed through the house. Mrs. Hai tried to stop her, but she kept bowing toward her mother's altar, tears streaming. This time, even without a voice, her twisted face showed a pain that was unmistakably real. But perhaps the truth had come too late. The 3 incense sticks on the altar suddenly began to burn with unnatural speed. Their ash bent down, nearly touching the burner, then did not fall. The smoke thickened, winding around Nam Hung's throat like a funeral scarf. Old Sao looked at the clock. Less than half an hour until midnight. He told Mrs. Hai to close the doors, to place a bowl of hot rice before the altar, and instructed Nam Hung to write down everything she had hidden in her heart. If she could not write, she should mouth every word for her mother to hear. Nam Hung's hand shook as she picked up the pen. The first stroke veered off course. She managed to write the word mother, then her hand spasmed. She wrote I'm sorry, but her tears fell and blurred the ink. When she reached the word child, her throat swelled alarmingly. She dropped the pen and clutched her neck, her eyes rolling white. Old Sao leapt to his feet. The 3 incense sticks on the altar snapped simultaneously. The house lights flickered on and off. From the shack behind the garden, the creaking of the wooden platform stopped. A cold, absolute silence descended. And then from Nam Hung's throat, not her mother's voice, not Tam's voice, but dozens of crying voices erupting at once, a confused, overlapping murmur, as though all the unclaimed dead across the river had found their way home at last. Nam Hung collapsed before the altar, and her hands rose again. But this time, instead of slapping her face, her fingers pointed straight toward her own eyes. Mrs. Hai screamed and lunged to grab her wrists. Old Sao threw himself from behind, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. The small bell he had brought fell to the floor, rolled once, and rang out, a thin, cold sound, then lay still beside the spilled white bone ash that had clumped into long streaks like the marks of grasping hands. In the house, the lights flickered madly. With each flash, those watching saw a different face on Nam Hung, now the face of a woman in her 50s, terrified, cheeks swollen, lips split, tears streaming. Then the darkness would sweep in, and for a very brief instant, her mouth would twist into the shape of an old woman's muffled sob. The crying from her throat was no longer a single voice. It had layered itself, Mrs. Tulua's old and broken cry, Tam's wet and distant sob, and the voices of the nameless dead in the urns across the river, all braided together, rising and falling in a dense, anguished hum, making the incense smoke above the altar spin in a vortex as though something beneath it were breathing fast. Old Sao gripped Nam Hung and said through clenched teeth, his voice still clear, Sister Hung, listen to me, the dead don't need you to gouge your eyes out. They need you to look. You've been hiding your whole life. Now you have to look at your guilt, all of it. Nam Hung heard him. Even though her throat no longer belonged to her, even though her body felt pulled taut by invisible hands, she heard those words clearly. Her eyes opened wide before the altar. The incense smoke suddenly thickened, obscuring her mother's portrait. And in that smoke, the brick house, the altar, Mrs. Hai, Old Sao, all of it seemed to recede. Before her eyes appeared the shack behind the garden on that final rainy night. She saw her mother lying on the wet dirt floor, not on the wooden platform, as she had found her the next morning after covering her with the mat. She saw that Mrs. Tulua had dragged herself from the platform to the ground, one hand on her belly, the other groping toward the door. The bowl of cold rice had shattered in two. Grains of rice stuck to the mud. Blood from her fingertips smeared into the rainwater. She saw herself, her younger self, standing at the shack doorway, the white mourning cloth still draped over her shoulder, the envelope of money in her hand. She had not been ignorant of her mother's breathing. She had heard her mother call. That voice had been so weak it nearly dissolved in the rain, but it had still managed one sentence, Hung, let me inside the house, I'm so cold, child. The Nam Hung in the memory had frozen, just for a moment. Then from the yard came the voice of the host family's representative, we've added more money because you cried so beautifully. We have another funeral tomorrow, we'd like to hire you again. She had turned her face away and accepted the envelope first. She had told herself that her mother was old, that she was dying, that carrying her into the house wouldn't save her. She had told herself she would only be gone a moment. But when she turned back, her mother's fingers were cold. Her clouded eyes were still half open, facing the door. Her cracked, dry mouth still seemed to be moving, calling her child's name. That image crashed down on her, and Nam Hung convulsed. Her two hands, which had been pointing at her own eyes, stopped in midair. Blood from the scratches on her neck ran down, soaking into her silk collar. From the corners of her eyes, two thick tears fell, at first cloudy, then streaked with red. Mrs. Hai saw the bloody tears and screamed, still holding Nam Hung's wrists, still shaking as she said, Hung, speak, admit it, don't let Sister Tu keep crying. Beg her, say it in your heart if you have to, write it down, just admit everything, Hung. Nam Hung slumped to the floor, both hands pounding the tiles, no longer pointing at her eyes. Her throat swelled, a dry click emerged, then another. Old Sao quickly pushed the yellowed paper and the pen in front of her. Nam Hung grabbed the pen. Her fingers spasmed, her nails tearing the paper's surface. She could not write in straight lines, one character overlapped the next, ink smearing, tears falling and blurring the words. But slowly, one crooked character after another. But the story did not end there. Near dawn, when everyone thought Nam Hung was spent, Old Sao told her that she had to go to her mother's grave that very day, not to hold a grand ceremony, not to display a lavish feast to impress the world, but to offer a proper meal, the way a child should. Nam Hung still could not speak. She only nodded, then went to the kitchen herself. Her hands trembled, but she washed the rice, braised the fish, cooked the vegetable soup, and boiled a few sweet bananas, the kind her mother had always loved. The pot of rice boiled in the old kitchen, its steam filling the room with the warm fragrance of cooked grain. She stood and watched the steam rise, and tears fell without stopping. Perhaps only then did she understand, a bowl of hot rice, for an old person, is not just about filling the stomach, it is a sign that someone in this world still remembers them. At noon, Nam-hung wore a black blouse, a white mourning band on her head, and carried the meal tray on foot to the temple. Mrs. Hai Shuyan walked beside her. Old Sao followed behind, carrying incense. The sky after the rain had cleared somewhat, but the dirt path was still muddy. Mrs. Tu's grave lay low beside the columbarium. The freshly dug earth was still damp. Grass had not yet grown. The old incense sticks before the grave had burned out, their ash bent and sprawled across the ground. Nam-hung set the meal down, knelt before the grave, and used a cloth to wipe the clods of dirt from the small wooden marker. There was no hired wailing, no carefully crafted words, no one paying her to perform. There was only a mute woman kneeling before her mother's grave, both hands holding a bowl of hot rice, tears falling drop by drop. Old Sao opened the door of the columbarium. Inside, the nameless urns still sat in their silent rows. Daylight filtered in, making the dust motes glitter. Nam-hung looked at them for a very long time. She saw the urns without names, the faded paper scraps, the burned incense stubs no one had replaced. She suddenly understood why her crying had drawn them back. For 20 years, she had passed through countless funerals, cried for countless dead, but she had never once looked at the deceased as human beings with their own fates. To her they were jobs, fees, a place to stand in a funeral tent. And those who had no one to hire a crier, no one to make offerings, no one to remember their names, they lay silently in their dust-covered urns, colder than the grave earth in the rain. Nam-hung knelt before the columbarium door, reached into her pocket, and pulled out the final fee she had received from Councilman Trake's family. She placed the money in Old Sao's hands, then pointed at the urns, at the incense bundle, at her own chest. Old Sao understood. He looked at her, and his eyes softened. From now on, if you want to come and light incense for them, just come. But remember, light incense not to atone for your crying, but to learn how to care for people while they are still alive. Nam-hung bowed her head. Her throat produced no sound. From that day on, Nam-hung never regained her voice. Doctors said her vocal cords had been severely damaged, perhaps from excessive crying, perhaps from infection, perhaps from physical trauma. The living preferred the doctor's explanation because it made them less afraid. But the people of Kaduk knew the truth. That voice had been taken away in a single night, when a dead mother returned to cry inside her daughter's throat. Nam-hung's house changed after that. The shack behind the garden was not torn down. She repaired the tin roof, set up a small table, and placed on it one of her mother's old silk blouses. The broken ceramic bowl was reassembled with wire and set beside a small oil lamp. Every evening, she cooked a bowl of hot rice and placed it on her mother's altar before eating her own meal. She no longer wore gold. She no longer went to funerals to cry. When people came to hire her, she only shook her head. Some spiteful tongues said she was putting on an act of piety because she had lost her voice, that if she still had it, she would be out there crying for money as usual. She heard those words and only lowered her face. There are things people say that hurt less than what she had heard emerging from her own throat at midnight. As for Councilman Trake's family, the truth about Tam's murder surfaced not long afterward. The laborer who had witnessed the event, after hearing about the voices in Nam-hung's house, could no longer bear it and secretly reported what he knew to the authorities. The husband and mother-in-law were investigated. More bruises were found on Tam's body. When the grave was exhumed and the testimonies aligned, like rotten planks fitted together into a coffin, the grand funeral, the hired crying, the magnificent wreaths, none of it could conceal an unjust death. People in the region told the story and fell silent. They said there are tears that are hired to bury the truth. But the truth, once it lies in cold water, will rise to the surface sooner or later. And Nam-hung, after that upheaval, made a habit of going to the temple on the 1st and 15th of every lunar month to help Old Sao clean the columbarium. She wiped each urn, replaced each piece of faded cloth, lit incense for each faded name. For urns with no name at all, she placed a small cup of water. For urns thick with dust, she wiped for a very long time, until her own reflection gleamed faintly on the glaze. People saw a mute old woman, growing shorter, her hair turning silver, moving silently among the urns of the unremembered dead. No one heard her cry anymore. But sometimes, on rainy afternoons, people passing the columbarium would see incense smoke rising straight and very thin, very gentle, as though someone, at last, was being remembered. Many years later, the neighborhood of Khaduk still told the story of Namhung the hired crier. The elders used it to warn their children, "Don't wait until your parents are in the ground to buy incense and candles and coffins and feasts. Old people don't need their children to cry beautifully before the world. They only need, while they are still alive, for someone to ask them, 'Are you hungry? Are you cold? Would you like a bowl of hot rice?' Fake tears can soften a stranger's heart at a funeral, but they cannot warm a cold grave. Money can hire crying, hire musicians, hire a white tent that covers the entire yard, but it cannot hire the filial devotion that was abandoned in the most ordinary days of life." On a late night at the end of the 7th lunar month, Mrs. Hai Shuyan was walking past Namhung's house, and saw a faint oil lamp glowing inside the shack behind the garden. Curious, she looked in. Namhung was sitting alone before her mother's small table, her back bent, her hands pressed together. On the table, 3 incense sticks burned straight, their ash falling evenly, no longer bending and curling as they had on those nights before. Beside the bowl of hot rice, the old repaired ceramic bowl sat in silence. Namhung could not speak, but her lips moved, forming word after word. Perhaps she was calling her mother. Perhaps she was apologizing. Or perhaps she was simply learning, at last, to cry with her own heart, without needing a single sound. Mrs. Hai Shuyan stood outside the shack for a very long time, then turned and walked quietly home. That night, the entire neighborhood of Khaduk slept in peace. There was no crying at 12 midnight, no creaking of the wooden platform, no voice of a blind old woman calling out in hunger in the wind. There was only the faint, warm fragrance of hot rice drifting from the shack behind the garden, mingling with the light, clean scent of sandalwood incense, gentle and sad. People said that from then on, whenever anyone in the neighborhood lit incense and saw the sticks bending, they no longer dismissed it as wind or dampness. They stood still and looked at their altar a little longer, asking themselves whether they had lived kindly enough toward the people still beside them. Because there are those who do not return from death to haunt anyone. They only return to remind the living of one very small thing. Do not wait until the altar holds nothing but a photograph and incense smoke to finally bring a bowl of hot rice to someone who once went hungry for your sake. By then, no matter how beautifully you cry, the tears will only strike the cold earth and dissolve in the wind. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel Kim Ghost Stories of Cause and Effect. We wish you a peaceful night and beautiful dreams.